Good afternoon, and welcome to this breakout session. My name is Hannah, and as a member of your academic team, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, which is proudly brought to you by BOQ Specialist. When I say the words nuclear and medicine, for most of us, the first thing that pops to mind is probably something along the lines of a PET scan. But for our next speaker, a key duty of medicine is the protection of human life, and this is a passion that she has brought into her work as a founder of the Nobel Peace Prize-winning International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Please welcome to the stage, Dr. Sue Wareham.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And it's great to be here. Thank you all for coming. And thank you particularly for not being put off by the title of this talk, which is pretty grim, and it does promise some fairly grim material that we're going to cover. But not only that, there's a lot of positive stuff that's been happening and a lot of positive stuff we need to do still. So the main reason I'm here is that as Hannah's indicated, it's really important to relate issues such as nuclear weapons to our work as health professionals and students in the health professions. So we're going to have some positive messages too. Sorry, haven't. Here we go. So you'll recognise that, and if you don't recognise it, you'll guess that that was the city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, more precisely after about 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945. That was one bomb that destroyed the city. Okay. So nuclear weapons have been used twice in warfare. The bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, a single weapon, and it killed instantly about 80,000 people at on that day, August 6. And by the end of the year 1945, about 140,000 people had been killed by that single weapon. Three days later, the city of Nagasaki was destroyed by a bomb that had slightly less impact in terms of mortality. About 40,000 people died immediately, and by the end of 1945, about 70,000 people. So those two bombs between them killed about 200,000 people within the course of 5 months. Now, what actually happens in the event of a nuclear weapon explosion? Initially, there's an intense flash of light which can be blinding for some kilometres around. Then there's an enormous blast wave which causes tornado force winds and hence the collapse of buildings, flying glass and all sorts of other building material as debris for many kilometres around. The heat of the explosion is intense and it causes a fireball, which is a mass of very hot air which rises up into the atmosphere with weapons residue, and as it rises it expands and causes a characteristic mushroom shape. The winds and intense heat cause firestorms which ravage through the city, again for many kilometres. And remember that cities, urban centres, have vast amounts of combustible material. So for the people who are victims to these explosions, what actually happens? Well, there are multiple types of injuries, severe burns, of course, multiple fractures, blast injuries, head injuries, chest injuries, abdominal. Some would be blinded from the initial flash, and some would be trapped under building rubble. Remember that health services tend to be located centrally in cities, so most healthcare services would be destroyed. Those that were left remaining would be overwhelmed. And the devastation would be added to by the radioactivity in the landscape, which would make any rescue effort additionally difficult. And healthcare, of course, depends not just on buildings standing and people being alive and well to work in them, but it depends on electricity, sewage, transport, communications, all sorts of infrastructure which should also be destroyed. So the message is that in the event of a nuclear explosion, there is very little assistance that can be offered to any survivors, even clean water or basic medical care. After a variable period, which can be hours, days, or weeks, there's the onset of radiation sickness, which attacks the areas of the body where the cells are turning over most rapidly, so hair loss, gastrointestinal effects, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, ulceration, the bone marrow, so loss of white blood cells leading to sepsis, which can be fatal, anemia, bleeding, etc., and central nervous system involvement, which is often terminal. And we shouldn't forget also the psychological effects of all of this. And the experience of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was that many people, those who survived, were incapable of any organised activity. In the longer term, the radioactive fallout leads to cancers later on, and that's been the experience at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In those cities, cancer rates are still above baseline, what would be expected even 70 plus years after those cities were destroyed. The Red Cross hospitals in Hiroshima and Nagasaki monitor the cancers, and that was a report 3 years ago from them. I'll move on fairly quickly because I've got a little timer ticking away here. I'm going to bring us up to date. So how many nuclear weapons are there in the world now? There are just under 15,000, and the vast majority, 90+% of them, belong to the US and Russia. As you can see from those figures, France, China and UK have much, much smaller numbers. India and Pakistan, slightly smaller numbers again. Israel has about 80, and North Korea probably has somewhere under 10, but we don't know that number. In fact, we don't know any of those numbers for certain. In addition, the US and Russia have kept about 1,800 of their weapons on high alert, which means they can be launched within about 5 to 15 minutes notice of an incoming missile strike from the other side. Now that notice alarm might be a false alarm, or it might be a real, true alarm of an incoming missile strike. But there's a very small window of minutes in which a commander would need to decide whether to retaliate. In 2014, Chatham House studied this effect and concluded that there'd been at least 13 instances since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 when nuclear weapons were nearly used. This is a film, The Man Who Saved the World. You might not have seen it. It's a great film. It's a documentary drama about a man who literally saved the world. He was a Russian commander on duty one night in 1983 when alarms went off about US missile strike coming in. He concluded correctly that it was a false alarm, but he was under enormous pressure to make the right call, and fortunately he did, but that's not the only instance, so that's a great film to watch out for. There's a further risk of nuclear winter, and I won't say much about this, but the credible studies have concluded that in the event of a so-called small nuclear war with the use of, say, 100 nuclear missiles between perhaps India and Pakistan, the amount of particulate matter that would be drawn up into the atmosphere would be sufficient to block sunlight for up to a decade, to reduce agriculture, to reduce key crops such as soy, wheat, rice, corn, and lead to risk of starvation for up to 2 billion people. Nuclear testing has been conducted with pretty devastating effects on human health around the world. I will skip over that. So our danger now is the greatest it has been since 1953. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist Doomsday Clock, which you might be familiar with, the hands of the clock are reset every January. This year the hands were advanced from 2.5 minutes to 2 minutes to midnight, which is where they were in 1953 at the height of the Cold War, and they haven't been that close since that time. So our situation is pretty accurately described by the old acronym Mutually Assured Destruction, MAD. And I'll add to this that the Australian government is part of the problem in this, because the Australian government still subscribes to the notion that nuclear weapons actually keep us safe. So Australia and our policies are part of the problem with this. So if we conclude that this is a health problem, and I haven't asked you, you might agree, you might disagree, but I'm going to assume that we regard this as a health problem. So what can we do about it? And one of the initiatives which has taken off in the past decade is particularly important and a really proud moment for us here in Australia, because it was the launching of ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which was launched in 2007 in Melbourne by an Australian group, the Medical Association for Prevention of War, which I and a couple of others here are pretty closely involved with. So ICAN was launched really because of the knowledge of a small number of health professionals about the sort of stuff I've just gone over. The knowledge of what is at risk, what is at stake, how close we have come on so many occasions to pretty much nuclear annihilation, but also a commitment to do something about it, and that's the important part. So ICAN's goal always has been a nuclear weapons prohibition treaty, and after a decade of work with civil society and governments working together, such a treaty was concluded. It was negotiated last year, and that's the first page of it. And it was adopted as a UN document on the 7th of July last year. So we're coming up to the first anniversary of the adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And it'll come into effect when 50 countries have both signed and ratified it. And the purpose of the treaty is to stigmatise these weapons, to create new ways of thinking about the weapons, not as status symbols, but as symbols of pariah status, to put those countries who keep these weapons in the category of pariah states. And we've got some pretty good evidence that that's the way it's going to turn out. And ICAN was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize last year for the work it had done over the preceding decade. There have been a number of key and hugely important partner organisations also. The Red Cross and Red Crescent movement has a strong commitment to the abolition of nuclear weapons. I'll just flip through these slides. The AMA has played a very important role with policies in relation to nuclear weapons. World Medical Association also has had strong policies for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. And this was a statement which was produced last year in relation to the treaty by those organisations. Okay, so what can we do? We're all busy people, and we all have a lot of concerns, a lot of things to focus on. So what can we do about this particular problem? I think the first thing is to make sure we know what we're talking about, and we need to have some information for that, which you can find on the ICAN website or the MAPW website. It's important also to spread the word about this, because this issue doesn't get talked about nearly as much as it needs to be, and particularly in health circles. And it's really important for us all to play a role there as best we can, whether that's just talking with colleagues, talking with other students, using social media or whatever sort of media, writing something for any publication that you have access to, ensuring policies. Policies from health organisations are really important because they help add to the momentum. So whether it's a policy put out by AMSA or the AMA or medical colleges or other health bodies, they really add to the discussion about this and add to the strength of our movement. So that's important. You can join MAPW if you'd like to. It's free for students, and we're always very welcoming for new student and young doctor members. And we have at the moment, and I would encourage you all to sign this statement, which you can find on the MAPW website. I think there are some hard copies down here, but you'd probably prefer to do it online. So it's just simply a statement that as healthcare professionals and students in the healthcare professions, I want my government to sign this new treaty. The Australian government has not signed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, said it has no intention of doing so. we need to hold them to account for that, and we want as many health professionals and students in this country signing that statement. So I'd urge you to have a look at that and sign on to it. Send your MPs a message. That's actually pretty easy to do these days. ICANN has a parliamentarian's pledge. Ask them if they signed it. If not, why not? Urge them to. Divesting is important. The one I've got in bold down the bottom, check whether your university has a policy excluding investments in nuclear weapons companies, and that's an important activity also. MAPW is part of a global network in IPPNW, so that's always that's a good thing to be involved in. And for any cyclists, ICANN is having a bike ride in September from Melbourne to Canberra to carry the new treaty and the Nobel Peace Prize medal. So if you'd like to do that, if you would like to ride from Melbourne to Canberra or part of it, then you can find out more about that, and you would be very welcome. Just going to show a few slides, just some actions which have been taken, just small actions which people do pretty often outside Julie Bishop's office. I was presenting her with a copy of the treaty to sign. This was a bit of dress-up, bit of street theatre. This is trying to dismantle a nuclear bomb. And these are a couple of actions up at Parliament House, which I'll skip over. That was at Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade after the treaty was negotiated. Not advocating that particular action for everybody, but if you're into that sort of thing, then that was quite effective. And this was Peace Boat, which came to Fremantle and quite a number of other cities early this year. Okay, and that's that sign-on statement again. Okay. A couple of minutes left. Okay. I'm just going to digress very slightly. This is not specifically in relation to nuclear weapons, but this was an action that MAPW did on Remembrance Day, commemorating the end of World War I. So in addition to regarding nuclear weapons as a health problem, I think we need to look at the health impacts of warfare and armed conflict generally. And I'd be happy to say more about that, but they're very diverse, they're very severe, intense and long-lasting, and we need to talk about war as a health problem. And the fact that war has become normalised in Australia. Australia has been at war since 2001. It's the longest period ever, and there's no end in sight to Australia being at war. We spend $95 million every day on war and preparations for war. Okay, just going to come back to the nuclear weapons problem before finishing off. And the name ICANN was chosen deliberately, partly because, all the important words are in there, the words fitted, but also because we want people to know that there's something that all of us can do to help with this problem. I can do something. I can't solve this problem by myself, but I can do something, and I will do what I'm able to do to highlight the nuclear weapons problem and to ensure that our own country and other countries are taking this problem seriously and working to get rid of these weapons, not just to keep the number of 15,000, but to get rid of every one of those 15,000. So there's something that every one of us can do. And to emphasise the important role that civil society and particularly the health professions have played in this, and I think it's really important that we remember that we are not powerless in this or in other struggles for the common good. We are not powerless. There's a historian in the US, his name is Lawrence Whitner, who's documented the number of times when the use of nuclear weapons has been recommended in the countries that have them. It's quite a large number of times the use of these weapons has been recommended, but no leader has yet taken that decision again since 1945 to use these weapons. And Whitner has documented that the main reason for that is because public opinion would not tolerate it. Countries know that their people and people around the world will not tolerate the use of these weapons again. So I think that's hugely powerful encouragement for us to keep going. But it's important that we don't rest on the laurels of what's happened already. The fact that these weapons haven't been used again since 1945 doesn't mean that they won't be used again. And most authorities say unless we get rid of the weapons, they will be used again. So we need to keep going and we need to augment our activity. And finally, don't let anybody tell you that this is too political. Yes, it is political, but it's primarily health. And we could look at a lot of issues, similar, different issues: tobacco smoking, tobacco advertising, asbestos mining, healthcare funding, landmines, a whole range of issues. You might say, oh, that's too political, that's not for me. But these are health issues because they devastate health and they devastate human lives. And we need to get a grip on all of those things that devastate health and human lives. And nuclear weapons are the one thing on a par with climate change that have the capacity to truly devastate the world as we know it. So thank you. That's all from me. Until question time.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Sue. I'm sure everyone really enjoyed it. We're just going to do a few questions from the audience now, and we're going to be using these fancy new cube mics that I think Dean and Charlie have over here. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, just raise your hand and someone will toss a microphone over to you. Do we have anyone who'd like to kick us off? Okay, if not, I might sneak in there and ask a question of my own. You've obviously been able to incorporate your passion for action against nuclear weapons into your career. Do you have any advice for medical students who'd like to incorporate social justice into their work as doctors? I think if you just speak, it'll...
Working? Yeah. That's a very good question, and one of the challenges for all of us is how to do this stuff when we are so busy. And there's no right answer to that, and I think it varies depending on the stage of life, and I tend to think of our lives as sort of seasons. There are times when we can do a lot on the things we're passionate about, and there are times when it's harder to do a lot about the things that we're passionate about. So I don't think we should feel bad if we can't go gung-ho on something that we regard as really important. Having said that, I think there are some issues that we really do need to commit to doing something on, whatever we can at whatever stage of life we're at. So we need to seek out those things that are not hugely time demanding, unless we want them to be, and yet can make a difference. And that's why we've tried to identify things which are not too difficult for people to, students and young doctors to take on board. And for students, I guess some of the easier things might be, or some of the things that might be worth considering are just talking about this with your colleagues. In particular, talk about it with your lecturers. Let them know that you're concerned about this, and hey, what about a lecture on this subject? And it can be brought into to lectures on a whole range of issues, really. I mean, in our movement, we've had specialists in a number of different specialties who can relate nuclear weapons to their specialty, and it's hard to think of an area of medicine which wouldn't be affected by nuclear weapons. So tell your lecturers that you're concerned about this, and could you please raise it in a lecture and let us know what you're doing about it. Maybe talk about it with your dean if you want. Find out if your university is actually investing in companies that manufacture nuclear weapons. And there's some research that has been done. There's a report that comes out each year called Don't Bank on the Bomb. It's done in the Netherlands by a group called Pax Christi, but there are country-by-country sections of that report. So having a look at where your university invests and if there are any nuclear weapons manufacturers there, that's a good project too. But I think that just getting back to the real nub of the question, it's just talking about it, being aware about this, raising awareness of other people in whatever way that you can do that.
Thank you very much for that. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to throw to? Okay, I think we've got one down here. We'll see if this cube thing works. It's the first time we've ever trired it out.
Who's the question? Okay. Is it working? Yep. Yeah. Okay. My question is, so if we got rid of the 15,000 nuclear weapons that exist, then what's the threat like for countries just remaking them?
Right. Yeah, good question, and a very important question. If we manage to get rid of 15,000 nuclear weapons, what's to prevent countries making them again? Yeah. And this raises a number of issues. Firstly, the role of technical verification. I mean, that field has actually advanced a lot. There's been a lot of work done on this particular issue, and verification by satellite, seismic, all sorts of means is fairly well advanced, and it's very unlikely that any country would be able to secretively create a nuclear weapon. So that's quite encouraging. But I think to look at it, perhaps look at it a bit more from a, ethical sort of point of view. The fact that things can be reinvented shouldn't and hasn't previously prevented us from getting rid of them. I mean, slavery was abolished, and people could always go back to the slave trade, and I know that there is to some extent a slave trade operating, but not in the today, but not in the same way that it was a couple of hundred years ago. Chemical weapons, biological weapons, landmines, cluster munitions, all of those classes of weapons have been prohibited by treaty, and in every case the treaty has been extremely effective in reducing the problem posed by those weapons. Landmine problem has gone down hugely since the Landmine Treaty was abolished, brought into play. And yeah, sure, countries could still make these weapons if they wanted, but they choose not to because they know that the weapons are so stigmatised now that they don't want to be associated with them. Chemical weapons is a good example because there's a Chemical Weapons Convention which has been in force for 2 or 3 decades, and we know that chemical weapons have been used recently in Syria. We don't know by whom. We know they have been used. So the message there is that there needs to be, we can never be rid of this problem totally. There needs to be vigilance forever, unfortunately, because some people we want to create evil things. But it's still not an argument for not getting rid of the weapons. And if we didn't have the chemical weapons treaty, then the chemical weapons problem would likely be much, much bigger than it is now.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today, but please thank me again in thanking Dr. Wareham.
Thank you all.